There are many people taking the angle on all of this history where they basically ask you to look at all of this from Putin's point of view and from the Russian
Right,
point of view, starting with Bill Clinton admitting Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic to NATO in the 90s,
right,
when it was not clear there was any serious threat of Russian aggression to those countries at that time. And this being the beginning of a series of insults to Putin and to Russia that would have had the understandable long-term backlash that we're seeing today. And you can add the bombing of Serbia, which was not approved by the UN in the late 90s,
right,
as another example of Putin feeling what just to him may have just looked like American aggression and American, quasi-imperialism. And then you
right,
add promising NATO membership to Ukraine and to Georgia during the Bush
right,
administration to this. And so,
right.
so what do you make of the whole species of
Yeah.
argument that we have to look at this from Putin doesn't look as crazy when you add up all of these sort of American insults?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess one thing that I would ask is like, are we? Because the argument is usually that Putin is right to consider NATO to be a security threat. Now, one thing, I kind of want to backtrack because one kind of amusing thing that I saw the other day, like somebody put up a graphic where they had like it was one of those animated maps where they showed the expansion of the sort of NATO zone to show that oh, Putin has a really good reason to be or had a really good reason to be worried because look at NATO kind of creeping up to closer and closer to Russian borders, and they were using like the color blue to indicate like deep blue for countries that were actually in NATO, and a lighter blue for countries that were a part of NATO's Partnership for Peace program, which Ukraine and Georgia became a part of in the 1990s. Well, here's the interesting thing. Like if you're going to put that color blue on countries that were part of the Partnership for Peace, you actually have to include Russia in that. So Russia was like the supposedly like insidious Partnership for Peace program that was like again supposedly a way to pull all these countries into NATO's orbit and threaten Russia. Russia was a part of that. Like Russia was at the time, this is during the 1990s, was very interested in working together with NATO. And again, yeah, I mean, I do agree that the bombing of Serbia sort of made a difference there, and I think made Russia sort of less NATO friendly. But even so, Russia was part of first the Partnership for Peace, and then it was part of this structure called the Russia NATO Council, which actually existed like until 2014 when the annexation of Crimea took place, and like things got really tense between Russia and the West. But like until then, Russia had been a part of the structure in which it was working with NATO, which was doing, and they were working on a variety of security issues, and among other things, NATO was helping find employment even for some decommissioned officers from Russia. So they were, so this was really not, a case where NATO was just consistently doing all these anti-Russian things. There was, by the way, at various points, Yeltsin and I think at one point even Putin had raised the possibility that Russia itself could join NATO, which certainly would have been interesting. And there are people who believe that the West really made a mistake in not pursuing that, and that there should have been more encouragement for Russia to sort of integrate into the security structures led by the West. the problem is that, in spite of making these, sort of pro-NATO noises, Russia was never really sure, and I think this had to do with there being, you know, different forces within Russia itself. But the Russian leadership really remained, like even in the Yeltsin era, always remained ambivalent on whether it actually wanted to be integrated into the security structures that were led by the West and, de facto by the United States, or whether they wanted to be still wanted to be the other superpower and this other like pole in a multipolar world of different spheres of influence. So I think because of that, I mean, I don't think it's just the West's fault that Russia was not, it was not integrated into the existing security order, or even didn't, join NATO, because Russia was never really entirely on board with the NATO, with like the agenda that NATO had and the agenda that the West had. So, I don't think that, I mean, were there mistakes that were made by the West? I have no doubt that there were. I mean, people are not perfect. But I think the blame, like, and especially in terms of the admission of these different countries, including Poland and the Baltics, to NATO. I mean, I think we see in retrospect that they really did have good reason to fear Russian aggression. I think they were aware of, forces within Russia that never really made peace with the loss of the empire, and I think they really did have solid reasons to be nervous about that. And I think that in terms of NATO being a threat to Russia, I mean, I think it's interesting that you formulated in terms of insult rather than threat, and I think that's how I think it was largely seen, because I don't think this idea that NATO posed an actual security threat. I mean, we're seeing actually right now that even in this situation where there's really like very, very blatant Russian aggression, NATO really doesn't want to do anything that would put it directly into conflict with Russia. And the reason for that, of course, is that Russia has all these nuclear weapons, which it has always had. And I think that there was a very interesting article that that was written in 2008 after the war in Georgia by a guy named, I forget his first name, but Vladimir, I think it's Vladimir Dvorkin, who was at one point he was a general and at one point a Russian negotiator in the in the arms talks. And he basically said, everyone knows that NATO doesn't really pose a security threat to Russia because given Russia's nuclear arsenal, it's just unthinkable that, NATO would try to go to war against it, or that NATO countries would try to invade it. And he basically said, the threat that NATO poses to the Putin regime is really not military, but sort of cultural, because, and this was written in a spirit that was critical of Putin, because Putin is really afraid that, if these other countries near Russia continue to liberalize and modernize and incorporate themselves into the world of liberal democracies, that is going to be a kind of destabilizing influence as far as Putin is concerned within Russia, because it's going to kind of show people that this pro-Western model really works. And I think that was the one thing that he didn't want happening. And I think in terms of the insult, I mean, I think the insult really is that Putin believes that neighboring countries should be Russia's vassal states.
Right.
And I mean, if you believe that, not having your neighbors in this kind of, vassal state condition is an insult to your dignity as a nation, then of course you're going to be a danger to the nations around you because you're essentially wanting to, keep them under your boot.